No one remembers exactly who laughed first. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel in an obvious way, just a small sound, sharp, dismissive, almost automatic. The kind of laugh people make when they're certain they already know the truth. The room itself was ordinary. Rows of chairs aligned too neatly, a raised stage at the front, decorated with banners that spoke of leadership, excellence, and ambition. Soft lighting, polite applause echoing now and then, the kind that comes from obligation rather than excitement. This was a place where appearances mattered. People here wore confidence like armor. Conversations were polished, smiles were measured, status floated invisibly through the air, shaping who was listened to and who wasn't. She sat among them quietly, not trying to stand out, not trying to disappear either. Her posture was calm. Her hands rested neatly in her lap. There was nothing about her that demanded attention, and yet, somehow, she already didn't belong. Not because she looked out of place, but because she didn't perform. Around her, voices drifted. People spoke about connections, about accomplishments, about family names that carried weight. Laughter rose easily when someone mentioned a prestigious school or an influential parent. Then the conversation turned toward her. It happened casually, almost accidentally. Someone asked where she came from. Someone else asked what her plans were. And then, with no drama at all, she answered a simple question. She said her father was a general. The words landed softly, too softly. There was a brief pause, less than a second, but long enough for the room to decide what it thought. A smile curled at the corner of someone's mouth. A breathy chuckle escaped from another. Then came the laughter. Not everyone joined in, but enough did. It wasn't the kind of laughter meant to wound. That's what made it worse. It was casual disbelief, the sound of people dismissing something without feeling the need to explain why. Because to them, her claim didn't fit the picture. She didn't speak like someone important's daughter. She didn't dress like one. She didn't carry herself with the loud confidence they associated with power. And so they laughed. Someone tilted their head and smiled indulgently, the way adults smile at children who exaggerate. Another raised an eyebrow, amused. A few exchanged knowing looks, silently agreeing that this was cute. A story, a fantasy, an attempt to sound impressive. No one asked which general, no one asked where, no one asked anything at all. The laughter did the work for them. She didn't respond. She didn't argue, didn't correct them, didn't shrink either. She simply stayed still. Her face remained composed, almost serene, not embarrassed, not defensive, just quiet. And that silence unsettled something. Because people expect reactions, they expect discomfort, they expect justification, but she offered none. The laughter slowly faded, replaced by new conversations, new topics, new egos demanding attention. And just like that, the moment passed, for everyone else. But for her, it stayed, not as shame, not as anger, as awareness. She understood something then that many people don't realize until much later in life, that the world often decides who you are long before you speak, and once it decides, it rarely checks again. The event continued. Speakers were announced, schedules were followed, applause came and went in predictable waves, names were called, faces appeared on stage and disappeared again. All the while, she sat quietly in her seat, listening, observing. She noticed how people leaned forward for certain speakers and barely looked up for others, how titles commanded attention more than words, how confidence, even when hollow, was rewarded instantly. She also noticed something else. No one laughed when men in tailored suits spoke confidently about leadership, even when they said very little at all. No one questioned their backgrounds. No one asked for proof. Their presence was enough. Her statement, on the other hand, had been weighed, measured, and dismissed in seconds.
not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient, because it challenged the unspoken hierarchy of the room, because it suggested that power didn't always announce itself loudly. The lights dimmed slightly as the next segment was prepared. The host returned to the stage, holding a microphone and a practiced smile. The room quieted out of habit, not anticipation. "We have a special guest joining us today," the host said. The words barely registered at first. People shifted in their seats. Some checked their phones. Others whispered to neighbors. No one was fully paying attention yet. "And before we continue," the host added, glancing down at a card, "we'd like to recognize someone whose presence here carries particular significance." That caught a few ears. She felt it before she understood it, a subtle change in the air, a tightening in her chest, not from fear, but from inevitability. The host paused, not dramatically, just long enough. Then he spoke a name, her father's name. Most people didn't react at first. It was just another name among many. But then the host continued, "A decorated general with over 30 decades of service." The room shifted, heads lifted, whispers stopped. A ripple of attention moved forward like a slow wave. A leader whose decisions have shaped operations far beyond this room. The laughter from earlier was forgotten now, but not undone, because recognition was beginning to arrive, and it never arrives gently. The host gestured to the side of the stage. "At this time, please welcome—" The rest of the sentence barely mattered, because someone was already standing. A man rose from the front row, not rushed, not stiff, measured. He adjusted his jacket with a small, practiced motion. His posture was straight, but not rigid. His presence didn't demand attention, it absorbed it. The room grew quiet, not the polite kind, the real kind. She watched him stand, her expression unchanged, no satisfaction, no anger, just calm acceptance, as if this moment had always been coming, as if laughter had never been the point, as if the silence that followed would say far more than words ever could. And in that silence, something began to shift, because the room was about to learn a lesson it didn't know it needed. Not about rank, not about authority, but about how easily people mistake humility for weakness, and how quickly laughter disappears when truth steps on to the stage. Long before anyone laughed, she had learned how to listen. Not the polite kind of listening people perform while waiting to speak, but the quiet, observant kind. The kind that notices pauses, shifts in tone, what people say when they think no one important is paying attention. She learned it young. Growing up, her home was not filled with stories of rank or medals. There were no framed photographs on the walls celebrating victories, no dramatic retellings of battles at the dinner table. Her father never spoke of his work unless asked, and even then only in fragments. He believed that responsibility didn't need an audience. When he was home, he was simply her father. He fixed things that broke, he listened when she spoke, he showed up when he said he would. That consistency mattered more than any title ever could. As a child, she didn't fully understand what it meant that her father was a general. The word itself sounded abstract, heavy, distant, something adults cared about far more than she did. To her, he was the man who reminded her to stand straight, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. The man who taught her that calmness was a strength, not a lack of feeling. That reacting quickly was easy, but responding thoughtfully took discipline. There were rules in their house, but they weren't harsh. They were quiet expectations. Tell the truth even when it costs you comfort. Respect people who can do nothing for you. Never use power to humiliate, only to protect. Those lessons stayed with her, especially the last one. As she grew older, she noticed how differently people behaved when they learned who her father was. Conversations changed, compliments became louder, interest became sharper, more transactional. She hated it, so she stopped mentioning him. not out of shame, but out of clarity. She wanted to know who would listen when she spoke without borrowed authority, who would respect her ideas without attaching them to someone else's reputation, who would see her as a person before a position. That choice came with consequences. People underestimated her constantly. They assumed softness where there was restraint, ignorance where there was patience, insignificance where there was intention. And she let them, because she had learned something most people never do, that being underestimated gives you room to breathe. It gives you space to observe, to understand, to move without resistance. So when she sat in that room, surrounded by confidence that had never been questioned, she felt a familiar calm. The laughter didn't surprise her. It didn't even hurt the way it once might have. It simply confirmed what she already knew, that people often laugh at what they don't recognize. Her father, meanwhile, had arrived early. He always did. He preferred to enter spaces before they filled with noise, before expectations hardened into assumptions. He took a seat near the front, not because it was offered, but because it was practical. He listened to the opening remarks with the same attention he gave to everything else, without expression. He had spent decades in rooms far more tense than this one, rooms where decisions carried consequences that could not be undone, rooms where confidence was dangerous and silence could save lives. This room, by comparison, was gentle. Still, he observed. He noticed how people spoke louder when they believed authority was near, how they softened their tone when addressing those they assumed mattered, how quickly they dismissed voices that didn't match their internal image of importance. He noticed his daughter sitting quietly among them. He noticed the laughter, not because it was loud, but because it was careless. He did not react, not outwardly. Years of discipline had trained him not to. Emotion, when left unexamined, could cloud judgment, and judgment, once compromised, was difficult to recover. He trusted her, he knew her strength, and he knew something else, too, that moments like these reveal far more about the room than about the person being dismissed. As the program continued, speakers came and went. Words filled the air, some meaningful, many forgettable. Applause rose and fell on cue. Yet beneath it all, something subtle was unfolding. Attention was shifting, not toward power, but toward presence. There was something about the man seated in the front row that unsettled people, even before they knew who he was. Perhaps it was the way he listened without nodding, or the way he didn't seek acknowledgement, or the way his stillness felt deliberate. People are used to power announcing itself. They are far less comfortable when it doesn't. And she, watching him from her seat, felt a quiet steadiness settle over her. Not anticipation, not nerves, just alignment. She had never needed his title to speak for her, and he had never needed a stage to be who he was. Whatever was about to happen wasn't about proving anything. It was about contrast, between noise and substance, between assumption and reality, between laughter and understanding. The room didn't realize it yet, but it was being gently prepared to confront its own reflexes, prepared to recognize the cost of dismissiveness, prepared to sit with the discomfort of being wrong. And she remained where she was, silent, grounded, unmoved. Because some lessons don't arrive through confrontation, they arrive through presence. And when they do, they linger far longer than laughter ever could.
There is a moment in every room when the energy changes. It doesn't announce itself. No one points to it or names it, but you can feel it, like a quiet adjustment in the air, as if everyone has inhaled at the same time without realizing why. That moment arrived slowly. At first, nothing seemed different. The schedule moved forward, the host continued speaking, applause followed its expected rhythm. People leaned back in their chairs, comfortable in the belief that they understood what kind of event this was. Predictable, controlled, familiar. But attention, once loosened, doesn't always return where it started. A few people began glancing toward the front row more often than they meant to. Not openly, just quick looks, followed by slight pauses, as if their thoughts had been interrupted mid-sentence. There was something about the man seated there. He didn't speak, didn't shift restlessly, didn't scan the room for reactions. He listened, fully. And listening, when done without performance, has a way of unsettling those who rely on being seen. A panel discussion began. Questions were asked, answers were given. Some were rehearsed, others were vague enough to sound intelligent without saying much at all. Still, the room responded politely. Then something small happened. One of the speakers made an offhand remark about leadership, a familiar phrase, something inspirational but hollow. It earned a brief round of applause, but the man in the front row didn't react. No nod, no smile, no approval. It wasn't disapproval either. It was neutrality, and that, somehow, felt heavier. The speaker noticed, not consciously at first, just a flicker of uncertainty, a moment where the rhythm of his words faltered before continuing. Because when someone with presence listens without affirmation, it forces the speaker to hear themselves more clearly. Around the room, others sensed it too. Whispers softened, movements slowed. The casual confidence that had filled the space earlier began to thin, replaced by something more cautious. She noticed the change before most. She had always been attuned to these shifts, the ones that happen beneath conversation. She felt it in the way people leaned forward now, in the way they checked the program again as if searching for context they'd missed. The room was recalibrating, and uncertainty, once introduced, spreads quietly. Another speaker took the stage, this one more animated, more certain. He spoke of authority with practiced ease, of command, of being decisive under pressure. As he spoke, his gaze drifted, just briefly, toward the front row. Their eyes met, only for a second, but something passed between them. Not challenge, not confrontation, recognition. The speaker straightened slightly. His tone shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Words slowed, claims softened, certainty became more careful. Power, when recognized, has a way of reshaping language. She watched all of this unfold without expression, not because she enjoyed it, not because she felt vindicated, but because she understood it. This was the moment people realized they might have misjudged the room, and misjudgment, once acknowledged, creates discomfort. Behind her, someone whispered a question. "Do you know who that is?" Another voice responded, quieter, less sure. "I'm not certain, but I think—" The sentence trailed off. Names floated softly now, tentative, as if saying them too loudly might expose how late the realization had come. Meanwhile, the host grew increasingly deliberate. His eyes returned to the front row more frequently. His transitions became more careful, as though he were aligning the program with an expectation he hadn't originally planned for. Something unspoken was approaching. Not a disruption, not an interruption, an acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, when delayed, carries weight. She shifted slightly in her seat, not of nerves, but awareness. She knew what was coming. She always had. Not because it had been discussed, but because these moments followed a familiar pattern. Disbelief, dismissal, recognition. The order rarely changed. Around her, the room was quieter now. Not silent, but attentive in a way it hadn't been before. People were listening again, not to the speakers, but to the space between words. The host glanced at his notes, then back at the audience. He hesitated, just briefly. In that hesitation lived 100 recalculations, how to proceed, how to frame what was next, how to regain control of a narrative that had subtly shifted without his permission. Because when power enters a room unnoticed, it doesn't disrupt, it reveals, and revelation makes people uncomfortable. She felt no triumph, no resentment, only stillness.
because she knew something the room did not yet fully understand. This moment wasn't about correcting laughter. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about contrast between how people behave when they believe no one significant is watching and how quickly they adjust when they realize they might be. And that realization was nearly complete. The host cleared his throat. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a different weight, measured, respectful, careful. As we continue, there are moments when it's important to pause. The room leaned in, because everyone sensed it now. Something was about to be named, and once named, it could not be unseen.
Silence, when it arrives, honestly feels different. It doesn't rush in. It settles. The host stood still for a moment longer than necessary, eyes scanning the audience, not searching, but confirming. He had sensed the shift, felt the gravity settle into the space, and now he understood that the program had reached a moment it could no longer move around. It had to move through it. There are occasions, he says slowly, when leadership doesn't need introduction. The words were deliberate, chosen carefully. A few people straightened in their seats, others clasped their hands together, suddenly aware of their own stillness. Conversations stopped completely now. Phones remained untouched. The room was present. The host continued. When experience speaks, it often does so quietly. He paused again, allowing the sentence to land, not for drama, but for truth. And today, we're honored to have someone with us whose service extends far beyond titles. Eyes turned toward the front row, all of them now. The man rose, not abruptly, not ceremoniously. He stood the way someone stands who has done so many times before, not for recognition, but because it was simply time. As he did, the room seemed to recalibrate itself around him. People noticed details they had missed earlier, the way his posture held no tension, the way his expression remained neutral, almost gentle, the absence of performance in his movements. This was not the presence of someone seeking respect. It was the presence of someone accustomed to it. The host spoke his name clearly this time, no hesitation, no embellishment, just fact. Each word carried weight. His credentials followed, not in a list, but in a narrative. Years of service, roles held not for visibility, but responsibility. Decisions made far from cameras. Leadership exercised where applause was impossible. The laughter from earlier felt impossibly distant now, not because it had been replaced by embarrassment, but because it no longer fit the room's emotional temperature. People weren't thinking about the laugh anymore. They were thinking about themselves, about how quickly they had judged, about how easily they had dismissed. The man stepped onto the stage. No spotlight chased him, no music rose, yet every eye followed him. He approached the microphone and adjusted it slightly, not because it was necessary, but because small rituals ground people before speaking. He looked out at the room, not scanning, not evaluating, seeing. And then he spoke. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, calm, even. No preamble, no attempt to command the space. He didn't need to. "I won't take much time. I'm not here to speak about rank or accomplishment." A pause. "I'm here to speak about responsibility." The word settled heavily, because responsibility is uncomfortable when it's real. He spoke not in declarations, but in reflections, about leadership that doesn't announce itself, about decisions that are made when no one is watching, about restraint, not as weakness, but as discipline. As he spoke, something subtle happened in the room. People stopped performing. They stopped nodding for effect, stopped preparing their own responses, stopped filtering his words through status. They listened. Because his voice didn't ask for belief, it assumed understanding, and that assumption carried authority of its own. She watched him from her seat. Her expression remained composed,
but inside, something softened. Not pride, alignment. This was who he had always been, on stages and in kitchens, in public and in private. The same calm, the same clarity, the same refusal to use power to impress. As he spoke, she noticed something else. No one laughed now, not even reflexively. The room had learned, not because it had been corrected, but because it had been shown. And showing, when done without bitterness, has a way of teaching far deeper lessons. He concluded simply, "Thank you for listening," he said. Not for applauding, not for agreeing, for listening. The applause that followed was different from before. Slower, heavier, not automatic, earned. As he stepped back from the microphone, people rose to their feet, not in obligation, but in recognition. And in that moment, the room wasn't honoring rank, it was honoring restraint. She remained seated for a moment longer than the others, not because she didn't need to display it. She had never needed proof. The room had, and now it had received it. But the true impact of moments like these doesn't arrive immediately. It arrives afterwards, in reflection, in discomfort, in the quiet reevaluation of assumptions people didn't know they carried. And that reckoning had only just begun.
Applause fades faster than realization. The clapping slowed, then stopped, but the weight of the moment lingered in the room like a held breath. People sat back down carefully, as if sudden movements might break something fragile. Because something had shifted. Not in the program, in perception. Moments earlier, the room had been comfortable in its assumptions. Now, those assumptions sat exposed, untouched, but undeniably present. And exposure has a way of making people uneasy. The man returned to his seat without ceremony. No lingering nods, no searching for acknowledgement. He simply sat, folding his hands loosely in his lap, gaze forward, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. That, more than anything, unsettled them, because extraordinary people often refuse to treat moments as extraordinary. The host thanked him again, voice respectful now in a way that hadn't been rehearsed. The schedule resumed, but it no longer mattered. Words followed, but attention did not. People were listening inward, replaying the laughter, the smiles, the dismissive glances, the certainty they'd carried so easily. Across the room, eyes drifted toward her. This time, they didn't linger with amusement. They hesitated. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed. Others studied her with a new kind of curiosity, the kind that arrives too late. She felt it. Not as satisfaction, not as anger, as distance. Because once you see how someone judges you before knowing you, something separates quietly. A woman a few rows away leaned toward her, then stopped. Words formed, then dissolved. Whatever apology or explanation had been considered didn't quite know how to exist. Because apologies offered too quickly often served the speaker more than the listener. She remained still. Calm does not demand reconciliation. Later, during a break, clusters formed. Whispers became more deliberate. Conversations carried different tones now, measured, reflective, careful. He really is a general. I didn't realize. I shouldn't have assumed. The statements floated through the space, unfinished and unsatisfying. Because realization without accountability is incomplete. A man who had laughed earlier stood near the refreshments, stirring a cup of coffee long after it needed stirring. His smile no longer reached his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was softer. "I guess you never really know," he said to no one in particular. No one responded, because the room had learned something deeper than her father's rank. It had learned how quickly confidence becomes carelessness, how laughter, when rooted in assumption, reveals more about the laugher than the subject, and how dignity, when maintained, leaves no room for argument. She moved quietly through the space, acknowledging people with polite nods. Nothing more, nothing less. There was no need to reclaim respect. It had arrived on its own, uninvited. But respect that arrives late carries a shadow, because it's accompanied by awareness of what came before. Her father noticed it too, not the whispers, but the stillness, the way people now chose their words more carefully, the way conversations slowed, the eyes lowered slightly when meeting his, not out of fear, out of recognition. Recognition that power had been present all along, and they had failed to see it. He felt no satisfaction, only confirmation, that humility, when genuine, disarms judgment more effectively than confrontation ever could. As the event drew toward its close, the host made his final remarks, gratitude, reflection, polite encouragement, but the real ending had already occurred, not on the stage, in the minds of those who had laughed. Because laughter, once turned inward, becomes self-awareness, and self-awareness is rarely comfortable. She stood near the exit as people filtered out, conversations hushed, movements slower than when they'd arrived. A few people stopped near her. One offered a quiet apology, another offered a compliment that tried too hard, a third simply nodded, eyes sincere but unsure. She accepted none of it outwardly, not because she was unwilling, but because she didn't need to. The lesson had already been delivered, not by words, not by confrontation, but by presence. And presence, when paired with restraint, leaves no room for defense. The laughter that had once filled the room no longer existed. In its place was something far lasting, understanding, and for many, discomfort, which is where real change begins. After events like this, people often expect closure, a final word, a lesson clearly stated, a moment that neatly ties everything together. But real moments don't work that way. They leave residue. The room emptied slowly. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Conversations drifted toward logistics and farewells, but something lingered beneath them, a subtle heaviness that hadn't been there before. People walked out with their shoulders slightly tighter, their steps more measured. They were thinking. Not about the speech, not about the schedule, about themselves. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, quieter, as if the world had paused briefly to let the moment settle where it needed to. She stepped out last, not intentionally, it just happened that way. She liked watching how people leave spaces. Arrival is often performance, departure is habit, and habits reveal truth. Some people left quickly, eager to escape the discomfort that reflection brings. Others lingered, exchanging words that sounded thoughtful but lacked direction. A few stood alone for a moment longer than necessary, staring into nothing in particular. They were recalibrating. Her father joined her without a word. They walked side by side for a short distance, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. He didn't ask how she felt. He didn't apologize for the laughter or explain it away. He trusted her strength enough not to soften the moment. Finally, he spoke. "You handled that well." Not praise, acknowledgement. She nodded once. "I'm used to it," she replied. The words were simple, but they carried years behind them. They walked a little farther before he responded. "That doesn't make it right," he said. And that mattered, because understanding without dismissal is a form of respect. They parted shortly after. No embrace, no ceremony, just quiet certainty that what needed to be shared had been. That evening, the event lived on in smaller spaces. Text messages, private conversations, internal reflections that no one would ever speak aloud. People replayed moments they hadn't noticed before. The way they laughed, the ease with which they dismissed, the confidence they'd had in being correct. Some felt embarrassed, others defensive, a few genuinely reflective, and a small number felt something else entirely: gratitude. Because moments that expose our blind spots, while uncomfortable, are rare gifts. She returned home and resumed her routine. Dinner, a quiet room, the ordinary rhythm of her life. Nothing about her surroundings had changed, but something inside had settled more firmly. Not bitterness, not pride, clarity. Clarity about how often power is misunderstood, about how frequently humility is mistaken for insignificance, about how easily laughter becomes a shield against examining our own assumptions. She knew the memory would fade for many, events always do, but the feeling, the subtle discomfort would resurface later, in other rooms, with other people, at moments when judgment arrived too quickly. And perhaps, just perhaps, someone would pause, not laugh, listen instead. Her father elsewhere reflected in his own way, not on the speech, but on the room, on how leadership is often recognized only when it contradicts expectation, on how restraint remains invisible until it is contrasted with noise. He had spent his life navigating spaces like that. What struck him wasn't the laughter, it was how quickly it vanished once truth entered quietly. Power, he had learned, does not need defense. It only needs time. As night settled, the world returned to its usual pace. Traffic moved, lights dimmed, voices softened, and somewhere between the ordinary and the reflective, the moment found its place, not as a story to be told, but as a reference point, a quiet reminder that respect given late still teaches, that dignity maintained always speaks, and that some lessons don't require correction, only contrast.
Most stories end with noise, applause, arguments, clear winners and losers. But the moments that stay with us rarely announce themselves that way. They end quietly. Long after the room had emptied, long after conversations moved on to safer topics, something remained, not as memory, but as awareness. Awareness has weight. It settles slowly, asking questions instead of offering answers. She carried that awareness with her, not as a burden, but as confirmation. Confirmation that dignity does not need defense, that truth, when calm, eventually finds its place. The laughter had not harmed her. What mattered more was what followed it, the pause, the recognition, the shift. Those moments revealed something essential about how people see and how often they don't. She knew the world would offer many more rooms like that one, rooms filled with confidence that has never been challenged, with certainty built on incomplete pictures, with laughter that arrives too easily. She would continue to move through them quietly, observing, listening, allowing people to show themselves before she ever needed to explain herself. That was her strength, not silence as retreat, but silence as clarity. Her father returned to his work the next day, as he always had. The stage had changed nothing for him. It never did. Recognition had never been the goal. Responsibility was. He understood something many never learn, that power is most visible in how it is restrained. That lesson had shaped not only his career, but his daughter. She did not inherit his rank, she inherited his composure. And that, she knew, would serve her far longer. Some of the people who laughed would forget the details of the event. Names would blur, words would fade, but not the feeling. The moment when certainty cracked, the realization that they had misjudged, the discomfort of seeing humility where they had expected weakness. That discomfort would return someday, in a meeting, in a conversation, in a judgment made too quickly. And when it did, perhaps they would pause, not because they remembered her, but because they remembered themselves. The world does not change all at once. It changes in small, unremarkable moments, when someone listens instead of laughs, when someone waits instead of assumes, when someone recognizes strength that doesn't announce itself. Those moments rarely go viral. They don't trend. They simply endure. She moved forward with that knowledge, not seeking to correct the world, but prepared to navigate it, prepared to be underestimated, prepared to remain composed, prepared to let truth arrive in its own time. Because she had seen what happens when it does, and she understood now with absolute clarity. The loudest lesson in that room was never spoken. It arrived quietly, in the silence after laughter stopped.